A lot of people are looking into EV metals and they're constantly wondering what metal is next to catch fire in investors' minds. We know about graphite, we know about nickel, we know about cobalt, but not many people know about manganese. What we're going to do throughout this interview is talk a little bit more about the uses of manganese. Where does it come from? Why is this a potential investment opportunity for investors? But also, there's a lot of rumors swirling that manganese may replace cobalt in a lot of EV batteries. In order to talk about all these various different things, we're bringing on Christopher Ecclestone. You are the mining strategist at Hallgarten Co. My good man, welcome and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Now, if you don't mind, just before we start going into some of the deeper questions, a lot of people are always curious about who we're bringing on and what your background is. If you don't mind, just giving us a really quick background of who you are and the authority that you have in this space.
Right. Yeah, I've been an equities analyst since the 1980s, and in more recent times, I've been exclusively focused on mining stories, and I'm also a commodities strategist, which means that I make projections about what the supply, the demand, and the price trends are going to be for various metals and minerals.
Very nice. And we're going to be talking about all of those things because we want to really paint a picture over what exactly is manganese and why should investors be paying attention to it. So to begin with, if you don't mind, when it comes to just those exact words, why an investor should pay attention to manganese, what's the case for manganese currently and what is it currently being used for?
Okay, so manganese has been around for, been around for as long as the planet has, but exploited since probably the 19th century when it was found that by alloying it with iron ore in the steelmaking process, you got a better steel. And that's still the case. So manganese is one of the biggest steel alloy minerals at the moment. That's probably why many people don't sort of focus on it because it's known as a DSO or direct shipping ore, which basically means it comes in really big, really high grades. And so you can have a mountain of manganese somewhere and you just come in, you claw it out of the mountain and you load it on a ship and you send it off to Japan or China or Korea for processing into steel. In more recent times though, more recent being after the Second World War, we saw the onset of the infamous alkaline battery, the AA and the AAA batteries. Those batteries are actually still the largest users of manganese in the battery space. So people are, focusing on the new usages in lithium-ion batteries and things like that. But manganese has been the key component in those other type of batteries since the 1940s. So in more recent decades, though, the lithium-ion battery appeared on the scene. It's come into, surged into computers and telephones, and now it's getting, where it's essentially pretty small batteries, but it's getting now boosted up into big size batteries for usage in EVs and in bigger formulations like buses and trucks, commercial vehicles essentially. So it's not the little thing that it once was, and increasingly manganese is, there are people out there who are looking at the potential for manganese to defray the problem that there is with cobalt in the EV lithium-ion battery space.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get into that question a little bit more specifically in just a moment as well. Okay. But before that, when it comes to supply of manganese, where's the current supply coming from?
Most of the supply at the moment comes from places like Australia and South Africa, where they have big deposits. They just come in, scoop it up, and ship it out. There's not a lot of elaboration of it. And the type of manganese that's used in the batteries is electrolytic manganese dioxide. And that is that's a more advanced usage of the metal than most of these other countries are doing. So in the case of Australia and South Africa, it's basically dig it up, ship it out.
Exactly. Well, and I got a specific reason for asking that. We'll go through that in the interview because I'm very curious about within North America, but we'll get to that in a moment. When it comes to the supply and demand currently for manganese, can you talk about where that supply and demand is over the next 5 to 10 years? Are we headed towards a shortage? Do we have an abundance of it? Do we maybe have a shortage of a certain type of manganese? If you can go over that really quickly, if you don't mind.
Well, the main driver of manganese for so long has been the steel industry. So if the steel industry, sneezes, manganese catches a cold, or has done up until now. But with these new usages coming in, parties that are producing manganese and then value adding to it by upgrading it into a format that can be used in the battery industry are more insulated from, the ups and downs of Chinese demand for steel, for instance, which has been one of the big drivers up until now.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to North America, is there any current large mines in North America at this time?
No.
There's none.
Well, it depends if you count Mexico as North America, but Mexico does have Grupo Outland, who are manganese miners there. But in Canada or the US, no production of any consequence.
Perfect. Well, we're going to come back to that because we talked about at the very end of this interview, we're going to talk about a potential company who's looking to be that mine. But one of the things that a lot of people are talking about is September 22nd is coming up, and that's Tesla Battery Day. A lot of rumors are swirling around what types of batteries you're going to be having. Is it longer lasting? Is it going to be something that you never have to charge? Is it changing the chemical compound of the battery? And the cathode, which is currently made up of nickel, aluminum, and cobalt. Cobalt is a metal in which a lot of people are looking to get away from, one, because of the price of it, but two, a lot of that is synonymous with, unfortunately, unethical mining of that metal. When it comes to manganese, there's rumors out there right now that manganese could potentially replace all or a good amount of the cobalt within an EV battery. Is there any merit behind that?
Oh, it's already happening. It's already happening. Over the last few years, there's been reduction in that's one of the reasons why, we go back to 2017, there was this enormously hot market for cobalt. The price soared to over $30 or over $60 a pound, and then came screaming back down again, because there was a big rush on to get access to the metal. It tempted a lot of people out to try and get into it, but the problem was that at $60 a pound or $30 a pound, cobalt's not viable for making batteries that are going to be economic for EVs. But there's a bigger problem than that. It's not the actual price, because when it comes down to it, if you're putting a battery into a vehicle that's going to be thousands of dollars worth of battery, in fact, the cobalt component is not that important. The bigger problem is that the Chinese have sort of corralled the biggest source of production, which is the DRC. Now, the DRC is been problematic for a long time with civil wars, political unrest, massive corruption, child labor, conflict minerals. Cobalt is officially under Dodd-Frank, one of the 5 conflict minerals, and so that immediately puts a cloud over it. But even more than that is that the Chinese have got their ways, let's just put it that way, of getting better access to the DRC's output than anybody else. So that means that effectively, if you're a Western-based battery producer, and by Western I also include Japanese or Korean, you're at a disadvantage to the Chinese when trying to get access to that product. Now, there's other cobalt out there. There's cobalt that comes out of some nickel cobalt mines in Cuba, which is a bit of a problem because the US doesn't recognize Cuban nickel cobalt and fines companies like the directors of companies that are actually involved in mining that there. And you have other mines like Goro, which is in New Caledonia, owned by Vale. And there's some cobalt production out of places like Sudbury. And so Voisey's Bay. But the problem there is that it's only a byproduct of nickel. So if the nickel price is good, the nickel producers will produce more nickel and, as a result, more cobalt. But it's not enough. That cobalt's being taken already, because cobalt is not just a product for the lithium-ion battery space. It's used in the paint industry and coatings and all sorts of other usages. So batteries have to compete against them. So for the last probably 5 to 8 years, there's been a bit of a race on in the technology space related to lithium-ion batteries to try and get down the proportion of cobalt in the batteries, because cobalt has its advantages in the batteries, but at the same time, if you can't be guaranteed that you're going to be able to produce build a factory in the Carolinas or in Europe or elsewhere and get a supply of cobalt because the Chinese corralled all the DRC's output, then you're in a potentially vulnerable position that you could spend $1 billion building a factory and be able to get all the other components, whether it's the lithium, the manganese, the aluminium, whatever, but not the cobalt. In which case, your factory is useless because you've got nearly all the components, but not all of them. And that has meant that people are trying to drive down the proportion of cobalt in a battery without compromising the distance that the battery can move the car without being recharged, all those type of factors. And so scientists are sort of like in a whirl at the moment trying to solve this problem. And the problem is being solved. Manganese is rising as a proportion, cobalt is falling. And so they're looking for I don't know, some people out there are saying that cobalt will eventually disappear. There are some battery formulations that don't include it, but they're not the most popular ones. So we really need sort of like a magic bullet that will finally resolve the cobalt issue. We don't need to get rid of it totally, but we do need to get it down so that it's not a threat to the viability of a non-Chinese battery supply chain.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that detailed answer, especially because my next question was going to be just that. Why would people be wanting to?
I jumped the gun.
No, that's okay. That's perfectly fine. We can put questions in any order we want to, but that's exactly what we were curious about. Why would people want to replace cobalt with manganese, which you've answered? But something else as well. A lot of people who understand nickel will understand, there's certain types of nickel, like sulfide, that you need to be able to use for EV batteries. I think you briefly touched on it just a moment ago, but is there certain types of manganese that you need to have in order to be used in EV batteries? And if so, how rare is that style of manganese or that type?
It's more what you do with the manganese and how you upgrade it, and if it's upgradable. There are different types of manganese, and they come in different contexts. I mean, I think at the moment, a more critical issue than just different types of manganese is where it is. The US has moved under Trump into this very nationalist position. And, the first, test is there a supply of this metal in the US? As with many other metals, the answer is no. The US has no tin, for instance. The US has no manganese. You may find manganese in the US, but not in sufficient quantities to make it viable. So the first test is it available in Canada, so next door? And we'll get to that later. Is it available with allies? Australia's an ally, so that's okay. South Africa isn't. Cobalt, for instance, is basically controlled by the DRC, which is not an ally. And it's coming out of Cuba, which the US hates. So that's another problem there. So the real test is the metal that you need for your supply chains available? And this point has been actually reinforced by the whole virus crisis of this year. And when people have been worried about supply chains, the people have been pushing back against China. You've got companies now saying that they want non-Chinese sourced material for all sorts of things, not just LIBs, but all sorts of different products. They don't want anything, even if it comes out of South America, goes into China, and then comes back to Europe or North America. They want to be sure that it's not going to China at all. It's going direct from South America or Australia or wherever, if it's lithium, for instance, into Europe or North America without having to touch ground in China.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't mind, before we start talking about within North America, because that's a very interesting point, and we'll explain why. But also, when it comes to the supply and demand of manganese, if manganese truly is adopted in a much larger scale, it's really adopted in EV batteries, among other things, but specifically on the EV batteries, we know that market is absolutely exploding. And if manganese is now saying, hey, we're going to have a good chunk of this battery is going to be manganese from now on, what effect do you think that could have on the supply and demand curve for manganese within this world?
Well, for the type of manganese, the electrolytic manganese, it's going to have a big effect because this is not entirely new. This electrolytic manganese has been around for a while, but they're just going to need a quantum more of this product. And so people will then be setting up plants. Say you're building a battery plant somewhere in the US to be supplying US production of EVs. They're not going to want to be told, oh, it's coming from where's your battery coming from? Well, it's coming from Wuhan. No, they don't want to hear that. They want to hear that it's coming from somewhere that's within truckable distance of a US auto plant. And that's going to be the future. So, and it's not going to be just the finished battery. They're going to want to know the whole supply chain because it's all about sourcing now. Reputable sourcing, controllable sourcing, non-conflict sourcing, non-exploitative sourcing, and green sourcing. So you want to know that it's not coming out of, because there's so many metals that are mined, but they're not mined in conflict areas, but they are mined producing big environmental issues. A good example is graphite processing in China, which produces a lot of fluorocarbons, which are recreating the ozone layer hole that we thought we got rid of. People are going to be now talking about green manganese.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's it's going to be a huge point of interest, and it's also conversation with a lot of our countries as we want to make this revolution. We want to keep making this move over to electric, moving away from fossil fuels and things like that. But it comes at a cost, and not many people understand that cost. And we can cut down that cost if we're doing so in an ethically way. We're doing it within nations that actually care about the environment, where a lot of times, like you were saying earlier about cobalt in the Congo, that's one of the ones that everyone thinks of right away as that's not how the rest of the world wants it done. So it is going to be very important.
Yeah.
I've also
getting down the carbon footprint of the maneuvering of any metal is pretty hard to do if you're moving, say, manganese from Australia to some port on the US East Coast. So the farther this, also, iron ore moving from Brazil to Japan or China, you've got these very long supply chains, and frankly, the carbon footprint of these ships is not low. It's big, and people are going to be worried. You can't get your carbon footprint down if you're moving a product 10,000 miles.
Absolutely. It'd be very, very difficult. Same thing with oil, but that's a discussion for another day. I've got a great question here. We always turn to our community to ask our investors some questions. And this investor had this question. I really liked it. I wanted to make sure I asked it word for word for this investor. And it was basically stating, how does manganese compare to other EV metals in both supply and demand and overall price? For example, the recent Minerals for Climate Change, the Mineral Intensity of Clean Energy Transition report put out by the World Bank, indicated that many key materials such as graphite, lithium, and cobalt would have to increase substantially, hundreds of percents, in order for in the coming decades to meet demand. How could this impact manganese in a similar fashion? Does it?
Well, I think one of the positives for manganese is that potentially production of manganese can increase without the price being damaging to the economics of EVs. There are countries like India at the moment that want to be big in the EV space. They also want to produce EVs that are going to be under $10,000 US. And you can't do that if your battery is going to cost you $6,000 to put into the car. It's just not going to work. So you've got to have batteries that are economic. And if you've got cobalt in the, cobalt's price is bad at the moment. So let's not worry about the current price of cobalt. Let's talk about cobalt when EVs really get going. And at that point, that's when the price of cobalt will start to, challenge the levels that we saw in 2017, which were crazy. But it'll start to get to those levels again. And at those levels, there were people out there who were saying, we're not having EVs because we can't afford the batteries because the cobalt component makes the batteries too expensive. Manganese is never going to make the battery too expensive. So it is the viable metal in the space.
Yeah, I believe I was reading that a lot of times manganese can be, upwards of 1/10 of the cost of cobalt, which, you know,
Yes.
if you're
Absolutely.
talking in massive magnitudes and really the EV revolution, that is very, very significant.
Yep. Yep. No, absolutely. It basically means it's more viable. You make better profits with manganese.
Absolutely. No. So Christopher, we've spoken about you know, what is manganese. We've spoken about where it's really coming from, the case for it replacing, especially in EVs, replacing cobalt. You know, some of it, all of it, or most of it. We've spoken about, you know, what was the case for manganese in general when it comes to supply and demand, and all these different elements. Now we want to be talking more on an investment standpoint, and specifically within North America. The reason we bring this up is that recently, it was the manganese is one of the 35 critical elements that was included in the Joint Action Plan on Critical Minerals Collaboration to establish North American supply chain for these critical elements within our borders. The reason why that's important is because a lot of these metals, which you just said, we get from China, we get from the Congo, we get from Australia, different places that are so far away, maybe it's ethics, whatever that is. We're saying that, at least Trump is right now, these critical elements, we want to be able to find them within North America. They're making a big point for that. Manganese is one of those. Is there a place currently within North America that has the potential for having a mine in manganese?
Yes. Yeah. No. There's Manganese X, which has a property in the Canadian province of New Brunswick, and they've been working on it for a while. The potential of New Brunswick as a site for manganese production has been recognised for a while. The prices were never high enough, and the thing is that the EV boom is not making manganese go crazy, but it's lifting the price up. And particularly if you can integrate it into a value-added chain of upgrading the manganese to EMD and then into the battery, et cetera, the whole economics change. And what was, not an alternative of mining in New Brunswick to provide the steel industry with manganese does become an immensely more attractive option when you're supplying the EV battery chain, which is a lot more high value.
Yeah, absolutely. And Manganese X is a company that's recently come on our platform at FTMIG.com because we started looking into this. We started hearing the rumors that manganese is going to be more involved in EV batteries. We started looking around to see what companies are really making that step. And I believe as well, their property is 12 kilometers away from the US border. And I believe it's close to trains, and even the transport, when you're talking 12 kilometers to get to the United States instead of how many hundreds, if not thousands of miles from other places, you're eliminating that carbon footprint, but also just in general, you're making it more economical as well. Are there any other points when it comes to Manganese X that stands out to you when looking into them as a possible and viable option for North American supply of manganese?
Well, chiefly their goal there is to take a deposit that has been known for a while, upgrade it, expand it, and then work with technicians and scientists and academics in the space to maximize the battery potential of the product that they'll be getting out of there, and so that there's a higher value added, and they have to keep that value added. Rather than let it go to somebody else, because this is one of the big issues about, anyone can buy, at least at the moment, electrolytic manganese out of China. But what's happening is it's mined somewhere else, it's taken to China. The Chinese are keeping all the value added. The initial producer, whether they're in South Africa or Australia, is getting paid a pittance for it. The Chinese are scooping all that off the table and then selling a product for much higher value. And they're not done. They're keeping the value added. And so I think the idea of keeping value added, integrating into your chain and making a chain safe against potential blackmail and geopolitical blackmail or manipulation in future years when things might get even hairier than they are now, is the main motivation for politicians. And now it's a motivation for business people in the mining space to capitalize on this rising tide of EV batteries.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, Christopher, I appreciate very much your time for going through all of these, talking about all these different elements. And there's just one more side of this I'd like to mention really quickly, and that's the data storage. I know that Manganese has been involved in helping with this aspect. We spoke a lot about EV batteries because that's obviously what people are really, really curious for. And we all know the potential of that sector. But when it comes to storage and other uses of manganese, do you see demand increasing over the next few years outside of EV batteries?
Oh yeah, well, this is one of the areas that I find most interesting because there are a lot of people writing about EVs and EV batteries and things like that. But mass storage devices are absolutely vital for the green revolution of wind turbines and solar. Because basically, with solar, you're producing the electricity during the day, and unless you're using it during the day, it's not available for you in the night. And so, mass storage devices, some of them as large as shipping containers or bigger, or farms of these large batteries, are the solution to mass storage. And the metals that are being talked about there are vanadium and manganese. These are metals that are available on a larger scale than cobalt is. If you had to have 20% of a large scale mass storage farm that was made out of cobalt, it would never be viable. It would drive the cobalt price insane. It'd be $1,000 a pound, and it wouldn't be viable. And so things like manganese and vanadium are being talked about as the way forward in the formulation of these mass storage devices, where you can stash electricity generated during the day and use it during the night. And also use it in places where you're off the grid. A mine in West Africa, for instance, a gold mine, might have no access to a grid, and maybe shipping in diesel, when all it needs is solar panels and a decent mass storage device, and it could store or produce and store its own electricity, and not have to ship diesel 1,000 kilometers or something to the mine, just keep the lights on it.
Yeah, very interesting. I appreciate that because I heard very briefly people talking about that aspect specifically for manganese, and I thought to myself, like, I haven't thought of that one. I've been looking into it for quite some time, so I thought that was very interesting. And you're right. Like, if you look at in Canada right now, we have something called the Global Adjustment Tax, or something along that line, where essentially it's stating for all that clean energy that we're creating, we're not using it all during peak time, so to store is actually very expensive. And it's also uneconomic. And of course, they put it right back on the user. So we're almost being punished for trying to go clean energy. So finding solutions for that is just as important as the solution itself of a wind turbine or whatever, a solar, whatever it be. Storing it is incredibly important.
Well, the wind turbines and the sun, you can only generate the electricity when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing. So when it is blowing and when it is shining, you've got to store what you get, because you may not have the demand at that moment. You will have the demand at some point, and it may be only a few days away or a few hours away. But if you can't store it, you can't use it.
Yeah, absolutely. And many people who are looking into this more when it comes to that revolution on the whole electric side and just being able to get away from fossil fuels, they have some way to go. But we're getting there. We're pushing forward.
No, but these technologies are tried and true now, and they're expanding. In fact, I've got the suspicion that some of the big grid companies and electricity generators don't like it, because essentially people can go off the grid if they've got their own storage devices.
Very nice. So to end off an interview, we've got a little conspiracy thrown in. I like that. No, but it would make sense too.
Conspiracy in one meeting? What's it?
No, exactly. Well, no, it makes sense though. It makes sense. Yeah. Look, it's one of those things where, as a nation, we're pushing forward it. There's obviously, like, with any change, industries fight it for as long as they can until they realize there's no more fighting. So if you can't beat them, join them. So let's see how fast we get there. We're seeing it right now with EV batteries and EV evolution, with all these other companies coming into it. Let's see if we can continue that. And of course, for all of those investors who are looking into the various different metals needed to make this push, manganese is one of them. We've spoken about manganese X as a potential horse to look into. We highly recommend doing your own due diligence, of course. It's always so important. But Christopher, I want to thank you very much for your time, for all the answers you provided, and look forward to hearing from you again in the near future if possible, but also following all of your research as well in this space. So I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Take care now.
Bye.